Now, I want everyone to be a bit patient with this little discussion this evening, because it might seem like it's not at all UFO related, but I promise you it will be when the time comes. But we need to go through what the Julsrud Figurines of Acambaro are about first, so that I can give a bit of context for what we're about to see. So I'd also like to have a little bit of discussion about how this landed in my lap, this very interesting situation. So I was hanging around a secondhand bookshop, as you do. I'd picked up a book and I was leaving, and as I was leaving, this thing, the spine of it caught my eye, The Host with the Big Hat, and I thought, what on earth is that book about? I'd already gone 3 steps past, so I took 3 steps back, pulled it out, and went, looked at that cover and went, it's about cowboys, and I jammed it back in. I took another 3 steps and I thought, go back and have a look. So I went and had a look, and I thought, okay, it's interesting. I still jammed it back in, took another 3 steps away, another 3 steps back, got it out and bought it. And I'm really glad I did. It feels like divine providence was involved in that crazy book. But it's called The Host with a Big Hat, and you would not think that there would be anything related to ETs in it. So Earl Stanley Gardner is the author of it. It was written in 1969. And Gardner, as you know, or may not know, but some of you who are around in the 50s and 60s would remember him because he sold a lot of books, 350 million books worldwide. He had a TV series. He was really prolific and he was loaded. And because he was loaded and because he had an interest in ancient civilizations, he would finance expeditions to Baja, California. So this is Baja here, this part of California. And he had helicopters, he had all sorts of things. He was responsible, he and his little team found a lot of ancient artifacts, a lot of cave art belonging to the American Indians. And he wrote a lot of books about it. Okay, so that's the first part, how we get here. So Acambaro, which is the discussion, the topic of our discussion, is about 200 kilometres north of Mexico City. In 1944, this gentleman, Waldemar Julsrud, who was kind of an amateur archaeologist, he had discovered the remains of an ancient civilization, the Chipiquaro, we'll call them, and he was quite well known. He knew what he was talking about in terms of ancient figurines. And one day in 1944, he was out riding with the priest, as they probably did back then, when he noticed all this pottery sticking out from a hill. He pulled them out and he thought, you know, this is not Chipiquaro, this is something else. I don't know what it is, but I'd like to find out. So he told the townsfolk that he would pay 1 peso, which is probably like a cent, really, even though it was 8 to 12 cents in those times. It was not a lot for anything that they brought to him, but his only proviso was that it was unbroken, or if it was broken, that it could be glued back into something recognisable. So that 1 peso ended up costing him a real lot of money back in 1944. Turns out the townsfolk were digging these things up all over the town, in the countryside, you name it, they were picking them up. And this is why. There were 33,000 of these things, or more. Jules Rud had a house, there were 14 rooms in his house in town, every room got filled up. He had to leave the house, he had to go and live in the country. But the interesting thing was, no one knew what the hell these things were. They're all dinosaurs. So it was so full, as we've just said, that he had to move. They were of prehistoric animals, and because of this, archaeologists were not interested. In fact, the government wouldn't even recognise them as genuine. Mexico has a rule where you cannot export genuine artefacts out of the country, but because they didn't consider these genuine, Jules Rud was giving them away. Anyone who came to town, he'd give them away. By the time the 1990s rolled around, there were probably only about, I forget, 5,000 or 6,000 of them left, I think. So that was in 1944. In 1941, a traveller to Mexico, who was a reporter, wrote this article, which attracted the attention of interested parties. Now, this is detailed in Gardner's book, but he doesn't say who these interested parties are. They're a very mysterious organisation with a lot of money. So they sent one archaeologist down before they sent Charles Hapgood down, who apparently left with his eyes bulging, and his report is what prompted them to send Hapgood down. So has anyone read Hapgood's works? Oh, yeah. I mean, Hapgood was really the king back in the 50s and 60s of alternate theories. He was a professor, he worked at several universities, he was an historian, and he was very interested in the human race and the history of the human race. And he wrote a number of books. These are some of them. If anyone's ever read any of those, they probably should. The Earth Shifting Crust and the Path of the Pole are about the polar shift and how that may have happened and what that might have done to humanity. Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings is about the Piri-Reis map, which seems to indicate that people were on Earth and were navigating the oceans. Sorry, I'm getting tongue-tied because I'm watching the clock. Were navigating the oceans when Antarctica was not covered with ice. So these things upset orthodoxy. People didn't want to hear about it, and despite the fact that he was a genuinely well-educated gentleman, they kind of ignored him. So Hapgood's first task was to prove whether the figurines were authentic. So he went down there, he dug up all over the place. He would walk to a field and he would say, dig here. People would dig and they would find these figurines. He walked to ancient walls and he said, dig here. They would dig there, they would find figurines. He went to the police chief's house and was talking with him about them. The police chief said, yeah, they get dug up all the time. And Hapgood stood up and said, all right, well, dig here under the man's house. So they went, okay. So they dug and they found at the depth of 8 feet, which seemed to be the generalised depth of where these things were being found, they found a figurine. So hoax or not, these things were everywhere. And Hapgood was convinced that there was no fraud. But if these things were real, or if all these dinosaurs were real, that meant that man had been on Earth for a lot longer than anybody had thought. But the archaeologists still weren't interested because the figurines violated scientific knowledge, which we know we cannot do. We cannot violate science, and therefore they can't have any archaeological significance. So, Hapgood knew of Stanley Gardner's interest in archaeology, knew he had the money, and he wrote him a number of letters and said, you know, you've got to come down here and see these things. It took Earl Stanley Gardner a really long time to get down there. It took him till 1968, which is about 17 years. But finally he did get down there and Hapgood was there to meet him. Jules Rud the elder unfortunately had passed away, so his son was left and his son had possession of the mansion, but no one could still live there. So everybody went to the mansion filled with artefacts and apparently with scorpions. By this time they were advised to be careful when lifting up things because scorpions were living under them, and looked at the 33,000 artefacts, and Gardner calculated there would be 2,000 at least in each room. And you can see they're pretty strange. So Gardner's recollection was that there were works of art. He felt that maybe some had been made hurriedly, but others were really complicated and would have taken days to do. I'm just giving you a general idea of how many of these things there were. But the topic matter was really strange. So there was a lot of interaction of people with these dinosaurs. So as you said, there were nude women struggling with huge serpents, great hideous lizards with sharp teeth, and faces, because Gardner was really interested in sculpture and art and he liked the human form. As I said, he said some of them might have been made by school kids, but there were 2 or 3 that were breathtaking works of primitive art, and yet it had terrific impact, which it does. They are really quite astounding pieces of art. So that's another example of them looking through the... Now these are the photos from the book, The Host with the Big Hat. So I'm sorry for the quality, but it was printed in 1969 and they were black and white. So some of the figures were quite clearly human, as we can see. So far so good. But some of them were really not. Now, by the 1990s, the town hall, or the city hall, had taken possession of them and they were keeping them in boxes. And a researcher went down there to have a look and only about 5,000 or 6,000 were left. So out of the 33,000, a lot have gone missing. And as I said, Julsrud was giving them away. But there is now a museum if anyone wants to go 200 miles north of Mexico City to see some of these pieces of art. That's another example of them. I think this is from the museum. So, what's interesting about all of these little dinosaurs is how realistic they seem to be. Like this little guy's howling at the moon, for want of a better word, but certainly making a noise. These guys, I'm sorry about the quality of the images, but you have to steal them from all sorts of places. I mean, whoever sculpted these, I think, saw these beasts in action. But they're also strange, they must be fake. This is why people aren't accepting them as real. Even now, today, there's great debate going on. Okay, so the detractors are still quick to denounce them as fakes. And one idea put out, this was in the 60s, was that a single family in Mexico had somehow, through the long Mexican winters, which you don't really get winter in Mexico, so they weren't sitting around the fire at night, had a comic book about dinosaurs, and they created 33,000 of them, buried them for miles around at a depth of 8 feet, let trees grow over them, roots grow over them, houses grow over them, you name it, but the family was never found. And also there's not many trees in the area, so to wood fire 33,000 figurines, they would have had to be cutting in truckloads of wood to do it. So none of that was ever located, but that's the main theory of what was going on. So when Gardner arrived, he went into the town to try and figure out what was going on. You know, they did all their research, but instead what he found was that there was just all this pottery and figurines lying everywhere broken. And they were very easy to break, apparently, when you were digging, you could break pieces off them with picks and shovels. So when the townsfolk realised they could get a peso for each one, if they found one, they would bring a bucket of water and turn the mud to mud so that they could pull them out without breaking them, because they really wanted that peso. There's another example of finding stuff in the walls made of the adobe brick. So they were pretty sure that these things weren't being manufactured and they were fairly old. But how could they be? How could people have taken or made images of dinosaurs? So for me, when I was going through this and researching it, I thought to myself, you know, maybe the figurines hold the key to this mystery. And I think they do. So in the 1940s, remember, when the figurines were dug up, there wasn't much known about dinosaurs anywhere. In fact, in Mexico City, there was one dinosaur skeleton in Mexico City. It's unlikely the townsfolk would have seen it. And, you know, we have to be a bit cruel to paleontology here, but like other sciences, such as evolution, they're working on ideas that were put out there in the 1800s. So we were working on these ideas that this is what a brontosaurus looked like. In fact, it wasn't until recently that they figured out there were two kinds of brontosauruses. There's a brontosaurus and a patosaurus. And, you know, Fred knew the difference. He had two different sorts. But guess what? In the late 20th century, paleontologists revised that view because they were looking at the pelvises, the thigh bones, the ankle bones. They realised that Brontosaurus actually stood on its hind legs, or did it a lot, maybe not all the time. And they've decided now that Brontosauruses stood up to eat whatever was on the top of a tree nearby. So guess what? The Acambaro Brontosauruses all seem to stand, or a lot of them stand on their hind legs. Which is interesting, because if they'd had that comic book back in 1944, they'd never have even dreamt of doing that. Similarly, this is the iguanodon, which was always depicted as a Tyrannosaurus rex, and the image below is the Acambaro version of the iguanodon, and everyone said, well, that's not true. But guess what? They've revised that as well. It turns out iguanodon walked on all four legs. So I think a case is being made at this point that perhaps these sculptors did know a dinosaur when they saw one. So this is the sauropod, what science believed it looked like, or paleontology believed it looked like. And again, when people are pulling the Acambaro figurines to pieces, they say, well, sauropods didn't have spines. Strangely, they did. And it was only discovered in 1991 from skin impressions that sauropods had spines that were between 11 and 9 inches long, so they were pretty hefty things. And they were made of keratin, so they weren't bone, they were actually skin, or like your fingernail. So suddenly these sauropods are taking on a bit more realism. I don't think that they were imagined. And I don't know how many different dinosaurs are in this comic book that was supposed to be going through the town in 1944. They had a lot. So in our new understanding of dinosaurs, Brontosaurus also has a set of spines, believe it or not. And oh, funny, the Acambaro dinosaurs also have spines. So I really sincerely believe these things are real. And here's another example. So the Acambaro sauropod has spines, but it also has a skin texture. Now you might look at that and think, well, that's just artistic license. But in that skin impression that I discussed, can you see this little star pattern here? So I've given it a different colour. You see how it looks swirly? So maybe that was an artistic representation of an actual physical feature. Maybe they did have swirls. Maybe they were a different colour, maybe they were the same colour. I don't know. It's an interesting detail. So here we have the humans. There are a lot of different people. I went, I'll pull the cursor over here and see the dude with the pointy head. Another of my obsessions, dudes with pointy heads. People that have viewed the collection, where'd it go? People that have viewed the collection have said they can see all sorts of ethnicities from Polynesians to Asians. I don't know about that. I haven't seen enough of them. But if these people come from the same era as the dinosaur statues, then they're very nicely dressed. They're not prehistoric savages. Again, some of them have oddly shaped heads and unusual faces. I'll just sneakily do this. A lot of them have boobs. I don't know what that's about. So there are obviously thousands of these different faces looking out at you from a long way away. So Gardner particularly liked this sculpture included in his book. He thought it was an African, but I feel it's not African at all. I'm looking at that forehead and that jaw and thinking it's possibly a Neanderthal. But it's a Neanderthal with a really rockin' haircut and jewellery, so I don't know what that means. So the question is, could they have all have lived together? What do people think? I think they do, because I think the sculptures are very lifelike. I mean, this dude on the right, he really looks like he would look if he was coming at you with his neck bent like that. There's a lot of life in them, a lot of realism. It's like they really saw these things in action. But more interestingly are all the images of the dinosaurs eating people. I really think this is the single most interesting point that points to authenticity. This is not a serpent, it has got arms. In one other photo I saw there was a creature that looked kind of octopusy. This one's being strangled to death by a prehensile tail. Don't get too close to dinosaurs. Here's another poor man being strangled to death. And, the guy's got his tongue hanging out. If you never saw a man being strangled with their tongue hanging out, you would not sculpt that. I would not even draw that. If I didn't watch movies, I would not even know that that happened, that your tongue came out. So, look at him, his hands. He's trying to fight this beast, but he's clearly losing. Here's another poor man who looks like he's had quite a fright to be snuck up on by this monster. He's smiling because, he doesn't have to worry about tea tonight. It's terrible. I mean, these are horrific images. They're horrific. This life, this world, was a complete disaster. Complete and utterly. You would not want to go out of your house every day. Look at this one. It's been snapped up and swallowed whole. I mean, really. Now this one is interesting. This is, I don't know, I'm looking at, the photo's terrible, but the ear indicates something a bit more simian than a human, and the sort of flattish head. And here's another one throwing a rock at something tall, I'm assuming a Tyrannosaurus Rex or something. Maybe a monkey as well because of the ear, but you know, this is a detail. And you don't normally draw pictures of people throwing rocks or make sculptures of people throwing rocks. And here's another man. I don't know what he's doing. This piece is damaged. There must have been a hand there or an arm. His face doesn't look unhappy. I don't know if he's attacking it or riding it or what he's trying to do. But we've got another one of a really happy man riding something now. Maybe it was a sport, you know, you find the monster in the swamp and you ride it. I don't know. And what the hell's this? Like, I don't know if they're going in for a pat or if he's going to eat him. You know, it looks like a woman. I mean, what is it? Like, who makes sculptures like that? But if you look at other pictures, kissing dinosaurs was what you did back then. So Gardner calls it strange philosophies, and what he's referring to is this little tableau here, which, on closer reflection, is a man kissing a monster or drinking milk. I don't know. I really don't know what's going on. But I call it kissing. I mean, and that's a lot of detail in that little face, kissing the monster.
Worshipping the face.
Worshipping, maybe. And what about this? Like, I don't know if it's a hug or if it's a fight. I don't know what's happening. It's this one. She's got a pet. I mean, seriously, what does that look like? She's feeding a pet. Notice the boobs. A lot of them had these big boobs. Oh, sorry. Another person with a pet. Don't know what that is. And look at this one. From the face or the head of the creature, it looks a bit of a mammal, but the tail has got spines on it. But they both look really happy, don't they? They look very happy to be together. And don't ask what this dude's doing, but they both look happy. And I can't decide if this is a hat or if it's the tail curling around about to, you know, get off my back, man. I don't know, but things weren't all bad back in the day. Look at this. What? I don't know what he's doing, if he's trying to pick him up or giving a friendly hug. Then we've got some more little figurines cuddling dinosaurs or some weird creatures. I don't know. And look at this, right? It is in man's nature to tame the wild beast. Could you ride a triceratops? And this man has got a cape on and a hat and a feather in his head. He's not a barbarian, and he's riding a triceratops. Oh, sorry, a stegosaurus. And look at this. Maybe we have to think about what we know about dinosaurs. Maybe, no, they didn't, but you could get around on a stegosaurus. Maybe Fred Flintstone wasn't too far off the mark. But dinosaurs are supposedly the progenitors of birds. Birds are very easily trained. Maybe we have to think about dinosaurs as being trainable if you got them young enough. So, what does science think about all this? That's what science thinks, because it can't stand it. It's blowing people's heads off. It can't possibly be real. So there's been many attempts at dating these things. There's been a carbon-14 in 1968. That gave it back to 4,500 BC. 1972, 3,000 to 600 BC using thermoluminescent. That was an interesting one because they didn't know what they were testing, and when they found out it was Julsrud figures, they retracted that and then wrote, and I read this paper, it was about 8 pages long, violently denouncing their own work and saying that no, the Julsrud figurines were only 30 years old. And in the 1990s, more tests were commissioned, and that's taken them back another 4,000 years. But no one wants to believe any of that. But I guess that it does upset a lot of people because we have a very rigid timeline for our life on this planet, and we're not allowed to get out of that, as you know. So that's our little rigid timeline. So here are the dinosaurs over here. They supposedly disappeared 67 million years ago, and I don't have enough time to go into how much I hate the dating processes that we use. Acambaro sculptures are back here, 60 million years separate them. And in the middle, we have the first early men, and of course the missing link, around 90,000 years. And I like the specificity of all these dates. They're awesome, aren't they? So could dinosaurs have been living a lot longer? I mean, that's our only option if we don't assume that people were living back in the age of the dinosaur. So we know in Australia that we did have megafauna. There's a lot of Aboriginal legends about the monsters that they used to fight. And as recently as maybe 15,000 years ago, which isn't that long considering Aboriginals have been on the planet, or in Australia, supposedly, between 50,000 and 80,000 years, but probably much longer. So these things were around. Apparently the woolly mammoth was still living in the Arctic only 1,600 years ago. I mean, these things happen. So could the dinosaurs have still been alive? I don't know. There are still instances of dinosaur sightings. You know, we've got that T-Rex running around the Northern Territory. There's the Mokele-Mumbe of the Congo, which is a brontosaurus type thing. This apparently was a pterodactyl shot and killed in Texas. I don't know how real that photo is. And then we've got the Loch Ness Monster, of course. So could it be? I mean, there was a movie about it. I remember seeing it as a kid, about the lost Jurassic World in I think it was in Texas somewhere. So could it be that there were dinosaurs in Mexico back then? Or was man living further back in our prehistory? Right, so now we've established that Lee believes that these figurines are real. But there's one other thing that is going to throw a spanner in everybody's works. And it's that thing there in the photo. With, you know, this photo taken back in 1968, and there's another view of it. Does anyone recognise the shape, perhaps?
It's human.
Well, it's more than human, I think.
Look at the size of the head in relation.
So there it is again. Remember, collected in 1944, put together with all of these things. I put this image through a lot, because I've only got one image, I can't find any others. I put it through quite a few filters to try and find out what we were looking at before I started making great claims. Now I'm making great claims. So there it is. Some of its face begins to be discernible. So we're seeing a bit more of the face now, a bit more of the features. Looking familiar yet? No one wants to commit. Okay, it's got two hands, as we can see here. It's holding something, clutching something. There's fingers. There's something visible over the shoulders here. And putting it through this filter, we can see the face is becoming more obvious, so are the hands, and it's sitting cross-legged on something. Don't worry about the dog. I think that someone in 1968 put that there to make a pretty little scene. Still can't see what the bundle is, so I don't know. But then this one becomes a bit more obvious again. So we've got more of the face. The eyes are much clearer, as is the seated posture. And you can see we've got a bit of detail of the neck here. I'll take it to the next one. So we've got some neck detail, the harness is more obvious, we've got some pecs going on, a bit of armpit. And two little lips, eyes. I mean, probably this has been damaged, it was probably quite delicate. But I do think we're looking at some kind of not human creature that has a very human shape. So there it is again. Is anyone?
It's not a grey completely because the eyes...
Yes, that's right. Exactly right. It's got face.
Large head, but,
yeah.
you know, I mean, it's got a mouth where the greys are not supposed to have.
That's right, exactly.
It looks like there is sort of a nose there.
Yeah, it's hard to tell. I mean, as I said, it's the only photo and possibly it's been damaged.
But there's at least twice as much skull above the...
Totally. And a tiny, could be, and a tiny little chin. And could be hair. I do not know.
That looks like a ball or something it's holding.
Yeah, it's a bundle of some sort. It could be one of those dinosaurs.
Looks like it's got two little ears.
The bundle, yeah. I don't know. It looks like an armadillo curled up, or maybe it's a baby in a blanket. I do not know. But if it is a grey type ET, and I think it is a grey type, obviously different to what we're used to today, If it was a fake, if it was made in the 1940s, then I don't know what they were looking at, because the first grey type ET was that of the Betty and Barney Hill abduction, which was in 1961, and even that didn't get out really to the public, and certainly probably not to a little town in Mexico. So I don't know what we're looking at. So those of you who believe in intervention, you'll probably be having a giggle by now. I know that I am. Intervention is the idea that an external agency, i.e. an ET, has been responsible for the development of life on Earth. So whether that's putting us here in the first place or just tweaking us as we go along. As we know, the most famous theory so far is that of Zecharia Sitchin. I won't go into that, but he believes that extraterrestrials from Nibiru arrived 450,000 BC and mix their genetic material with the primitive humans that were around back then. But what if what we're looking at with Julsrud is a snapshot of an earlier attempt by a different type of extraterrestrial to see the Earth? What if it happened already before? And what if it happened? It could have happened 10 million years ago, 60 million, or 200 million years ago. I don't know. And what if that first attempt was a frickin' disaster? You know, what would you do? Yeah, here's this nice planet, we're going to put some people on it. You come back in a few years and you're like, you brought them a present, but holy crap, they're all being eaten by dinosaurs. What would you do? I don't know. All right, so you might tell your children, well, come on, it's not all bad. You can work with them, you can make pets out of them, you can tame them, you can even ride them. Yeah, it's not that bad. But eventually, you have to give up. It's, you know, these soft, squishy little mammals that we are, and we are hopeless. Talk to the sharks that keep eating us. We're no match, right? You're going to have to give up. So the dinosaurs, you're thinking, you know, they're interfering with everything and they're just going to have to go. Because no one really knows what happened to the dinosaurs. Even paleontologists still argue. There are at least 15 to 20 different theories. The most popular one at the moment is the giant meteor, the Chicxulub event. That's the most popular one, but there's evidence to suggest that it wasn't this meteor that killed dinosaurs. And we won't go into that, but what if it was that meteor? And what if it happened, you know, not very far from the disaster that was happening in Acambaro? What if you said, let's just wipe everything off the planet, let's take them all out? You know, maybe they guided that comet down. Or maybe it's complete crap what I'm saying, who knows. But if there was a meteor, it would have destroyed everything. It wouldn't have just taken out the dinosaurs. It would have taken everything away, including your little experiment. But, you know, maybe that was all right. Maybe they thought, yeah, we're going to start again anyway, because they're funny looking. And they kiss dinosaurs, you know, that's a problem, we've got to breed out of them. So we only need to wait another 60 million years, and finally there'll be no dinosaurs, the mammals will be ruling, and, you know, life will be good.
Might have been a judgment day.
Might have been. So that way we could leave evolution intact, you know, because that experiment 60 million years ago or 200 million years ago was a disaster. We started again. There's just got this one hiccup of all this evidence that's still lying around. So back to this timeline. Our problem is that we have to bring these dinosaurs over here somehow, or bring the dinosaurs over here. I don't know how we can do either, but that's about it, really. So if you still can't handle that, if it's too much to bear that man was around with the dinosaurs, maybe the dinosaurs are still living now, and there's that pterodactyl again. And, you know, it is true that these prehistoric animals have survived. Maybe the Americas was the last stronghold. But even if we accept all that, it still doesn't explain this little figure here. Where did they come in and what were they doing? How do we deal with this? I don't know. Probably someone's destroyed it since 1968. Who knows where it could be? So how many other things are in there? Like, I got a magnifying glass out. I went through this book with a fine-tooth comb trying to figure stuff out. And it was something else in there. In this bookshelf photo that caught my attention, and it was the skulls. Now, if anyone's been here when Lee carried on about skulls, you know I really like skulls. And ancient ones. Okay, so we've got this collection. We've got these normal-sized human skulls, and then we've got this teeny little thing here. by the way, I don't think this is normal either. I think that's a very prehistoric skull, possibly a proto-human. But anyway, this little skull, and here he is again. I couldn't get much detail out of that, unfortunately, but looks an awful lot like a Star Child skull. If anyone knows a Star Child skull? No? Yes? Of course you all do. But briefly, this is the Star Child skull that was found in the 1930s and which Lloyd Pye put a lot of effort into researching, and he did get it DNA tested, and it was not quite human. It was quite different. And that's a bit of reenactment. So just to recap, the skull is small, it has a brain capacity larger than that of an adult human despite being smaller than a human skull. It's got eye sockets that are roundish and not square like a human skull. And you can see all that there. So looking at the Star Child skull, I think or this one, in the Acambaro skull, I think that you can make a case that it's very similar to the Star Child skull, especially the round eye sockets, the very flat face here. Also, a lot of the Star Child skulls are missing this upper mandible. Whatever they were, they're very strange. So there are a few Star Child skulls around, whatever they are. There's Lloyd Pye's Chihuahua, there's one in Oaxaca, and this one was found in Peru, and then this one in Acambaro. And that's giving an indication of the spread of these beings, whatever they may have been. Obviously the Peru one's way down there somewhere. So could any of their skulls match the face? I honestly don't know. I probably don't think so, but there were a lot of strange things going on back there. So now that I've talked your ears off, there's more questions than answers. I don't know, but we're down to 2. Did man live and die horribly with the dinosaurs 100 million years ago? I think so. Or were the dinosaurs still living in America up to modern times? And enough variety of them, because there's a lot of variety of dinosaurs, and to have been sculpted in great detail.